Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. So we're reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 10, Chapter 14, Text 26. Ajnana Samyau Bhavabandha Mokshau Dvau Nama Na Anyau Staha Rita Nyabhavat Ajasrachiti Atmani Kevale Pare Vicharyamane Taranau Ahani Iva Ahani Ajnana Samyau Bhavabandha Mokshau Dvau Nama Nanyau Staratagnya Bhavat Ajasra Chityatmani Kevale Pare Vicharyamane Tarana Vivahani Ajnana Samyau Bhavabandha Mokshau Dvau Nama Nanyau Staratagnya Bhavat Ajasra Chityatmani Kevale Pare Vicharyamane Tarana Vivahani Ajnana Samyau Bhavabandha Mokshau Dvau Nama Nanyau Staratagnya Bhavat Ajasra Chityatmani Kevale Pare Vicharyamane Tarana Vivahani. Ajnana, manifesting from ignorance. Samyau, which designations? Bhavabandha, bondage to material existence. Mokshau, and liberation. Dvau, the two. Nama, indeed. Na, not. Anyau, separate. Staha, are. Rita, true. Jnabhavat, from knowledge. Ajasrachiti, whose awareness is unimpeded. Atmani, the spirit soul. Kevale, who is separate from matter. Pare, who is pure. Vicharyamane, when he is properly distinguished. Taranau, within the sun. Iva, just as. Ahani, day and night. Translated and purport by the disciples of His Divine Grace, A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Translation: the conception of material bondage and the conception of liberation are both manifestations of ignorance. Being outside the scope of true knowledge, they cease to exist when one correctly understands that the pure spirit soul is distinct from matter and always fully conscious. At that time, bondage and liberation no longer have any significance, just as day and night have no significance from the perspective of the sun. Purport: material bondage is illusion because the living entity actually has no real relationship with the material world. Because of false ego, the conditioned soul identifies himself with matter. Therefore, so-called liberation is simply the giving up of an illusion rather than release from actual bondage. Yet, even if we think that the suffering of material illusion is real and that liberation is thus a meaningful release from suffering, the mere absence of material existence is still insignificant compared to the achievement of factual spiritual life, which is the positive eternal reality opposed to the negative illusion of material life. Ultimately, Krishna consciousness or pure love of Godhead is the only significant, meaningful, and permanent status for every living entity. Since the darkness of night is caused by the absence of the sun, one would not experience night within the sun itself, nor would one experience individual days separated by nights. Similarly, within the pure living entity, there is no material darkness and thus no experience of liberation from such darkness. When the conditioned soul comes to this platform of pure consciousness, he becomes fit to associate with the Supreme Pure, the Personality of Godhead Himself, in the Lord's own abode. Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhar Shivasadi Gaura Bhakta-vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare Hare Ram 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 Hare Hare. Yeah, I'll repeat the verse again. Ajnana samyau bhavabandha mokshau dvaunam ananyau staratagnya bhavat ajastra chityatmani kevale pare vicharyamane tarana vivahani. The conception of material bondage and the conception of liberation are both manifestations of ignorance. Being outside the scope of true knowledge, they cease to exist when one correctly understands that the pure spirit soul is distinct from matter and always fully conscious. At that time, bondage and liberation no longer have any significance, just as day and night have no significance from the perspective of the sun. So we are continuing the discussion of Srimad Bhagavatam. This is chapter 14. And chapter 14 majorly contains the prayers which Lord Brahma prays to Krishna after he mildly offends Krishna because he tried to make Krishna illusioned, whereas he himself got illusioned because of the Krishna superior mystic potency, obviously. So here, now Lord Brahma is speaking about the position of the living entity, and he says that the conception of material bondage and the conception of liberation are both manifestations of ignorance. So this is with respect to the living entity. So this conception of material bondage is an illusion. It's a manifestation of ignorance. So those who are aware with Srila Prabhupada's teaching, with the teachings of the Shastra, we know that the living entity is always spiritual and he's covered by the material energy of the Lord, and the constitutional position of the living entity is actually spiritual in nature and it's not material. But here the interesting aspect that Lord Brahma Lord Brahma says is that the conception of liberation also is a manifestation of ignorance only. So how is that? This is a subtle point that we have to understand. So when the living entity comes to this material world, he comes under the influence of the material nature, of the external energy of the Lord, but he is actually not transformed. The eternal nature of the living entity, the spiritual platform of the living entity, his constitutional position is not transformed by his contact with the material nature. So just like oil and water, they don't mix, although they kind of coexist on the same plane. Similarly, spirit and matter, they actually do not mix together. They do not become homogeneous. They remain their separate, distinct entities. So the living entity is always separate from the material energy. And the illusion that the living entity experiences within this material world is because of the covering of the material energy, but not the transformation of the spirit itself. So when the living entity comes to this material world, the living entity's eternal nature is not transformed. Although when we see our experiences with this material world, it looks like we are completely aloof from devotion to Krishna, from love of Krishna, and we are only tuned to this material nature. It seems like that, but actually speaking, philosophically speaking, the actual reality, the truth of the matter, or the absolute truth is that the living entity actually has no association with the material nature. His association is permanently fixed up with the personality of Krishna himself in loving relationship. So that is why, although the living entity is within this material world, now this conception or he does not get mixed with the material nature. So when something is not mixed, when something is not together, to get separated from it, or the concept of liberation itself is an alien concept here, because the spirit and matter were actually never mixed together. It's only covering of the spirit with or the matter, or its matter covers the spirit, but actually the spirit never becomes homogeneous with matter. So because of that, the conception of liberation that is being more prominently spoken about in the Vedic literatures also is actually an illusion only. So in the Vedic literatures, it's
moksha,
purusharthas are mentioned: dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. In the Vedic literatures also, this is very elaborately mentioned in different portions of the Shrutis. Vedic literatures, it's Samhitas, Upanishads. So these three, Brahmanas, Samhitas, and Aranyakas, they speak about the elevation within this material realm. Not Aranyakas, not much, but the Brahmanas and Samhitas, and the Aranyakas to some extent, and Upanishads are speaking about liberation point. But according to what Brahma says here, these are actually completely illusory. So the things or the systems or the Upanishads are speaking about liberation in the Vedic literatures. In one sense, if you see what from the absolute point of view, they're actually this is also spoken by Krishna. So the things or the systems or the Upanishads that Tarigunya Vishaya in the Vedic literatures. So the Vedic literatures do speak about enjoying this material world, elevation to heavenly planets. Then ultimately, once one has attained the goals of dharma, artha, and kama and becomes frustrated, then he has to elevate himself to moksha. And Upanishads speak about that. But if we see from only a superficial point of view, then this conception of moksha is also under the three modes of material nature only, because the living entity actually is never mixed with the material nature. So, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, in one sense, if we see, they are all actually completely illusory. And one who endeavors to attain perfection in his work of dharma, attaining artha, then kama. How Srila Prabhupada defines these four is: dharma is religiosity, which includes demigod worship, includes various rules and regulations that people follow, according to Vedic literatures, of course, to get something material or to get some material gains, which is called as artha. So Srila Prabhupada translates artha as economic development. And this kama is sense gratificatory activity. So once one attains artha, then he engages in sense gratificatory activities to enjoy basically through this material nature, which again, it's an illusory concept, because the spirit soul being not mixed with the material nature cannot actually enjoy within this material nature at all. So it's again an illusory concept, but this is recommended in the Vedic literatures also. So there's dharma, there's artha, then there's kama. And when one is frustrated with this material enjoyment, because his constitutional position being spiritual and matter being matter, these two not being mixed, so whenever the living entity tries to enjoy through this material nature, it leads to frustration. This always leads to frustration, always leads to fearfulness, and satisfaction is never completely achieved by the living entity. So then he looks towards moksha, and moksha also is described as an illusion only, because the living entity only has to understand and realize his constitutional position. He does not have to go through a process of actually disassociating himself from this material nature, truly philosophically speaking, because they two are always separate. So when the scriptures speak about purushartha, you can actually say that according to this particular verse, these are not purusharthas, these are purusha vyartha. Now when we say vyartha means completely useless. It's of no consequence to anything. So all this dharma, artha, kama, moksha, these are actually of no consequence for the living entity, because they are vyarthas. So one who aims for these four things is actually aiming for useless and unreliable and unnecessary things, basically speaking. So now this verse basically kind of establishes that all what the Shrutis mention about these Brahmanas, Aranyakas, Samhitas, Upanishads, then dharma, artha, kama, moksha, it all seems very useless. But then when we speak from Srimad Bhagavatam's perspective itself, or how our Gaudiya Vaishnava Acharyas have explained devotion service, Shri Rupa Goswami says, Shruti Smriti Puranadi Pancharatri Vidimbina Ekantiki Harir Bhaktir Utpata Eva Kalpate. So he says that even devotional service has to be performed according to Vedic literatures only. And he does not say only according to Pancharatras or only according to Srimad Bhagavatam. In this particular verse, he does not say only Pancharatra or Srimad Bhagavatam, which is the Bhagavat Vidhi and Pancharatri Vidhi and so on. Actually, he speaks about Shrutis also. So Shruti, Smriti, Purana, he quotes everything, right? So all these things are there. So we also very vehemently push that the Krishna consciousness movement or devotional service should be conducted according to the Vedic literatures. So, but these two seems to be kind of contradictory, because in one point we are saying that the Shrutis are basically speaking only about things which are illusory in nature. And of course, there's a reason for that. And the devotional service aspect also should be conducted according to the Shruti statements only. So the difference comes basically in understanding the actual goal or how the Vedic literatures should be approached. Because there is a sequence, in the 6th chapter of Bhagavad Gita, Srila Prabhupada writes about this yoga ladder. So it starts from Karma Kanda rituals, then it comes to Karma Yoga, then Jnana Yoga, then Ashtanga Yoga, then Bhakti Yoga, and so on. So statements in the Vedic literatures are actually given for the purification of the living entity. Although it's illusory in nature, but it kind of regulates the living entity's lifestyle. And although he's progressing, or his goal is now Purusha Vyartha, or basically speaking Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha, but because he's following the Vedic literatures, then his life becomes regulated and there's very little amount of purification that happens. So even Baldev Vidyabhushan, when he speaks about this in his commentary to Vedanta Sutra first text, he says in Athartha Brahma Jigyasa is the first text. So there he writes that one who has performed all his dharmic activities, then his heart becomes so purified that now he can inquire about Brahman. And then of course in his commentary he speaks not only about the impersonal Brahman but about pure devotional service unto the Lord. So there is a reason why the Vedic literatures are given. When the goal becomes only Dharma, Artha, Kama and Moksha, then it becomes Purusha Vyartha. But then when the goal becomes pure devotional service unto the Lord, then all these four aspects can actually be dovetailed in Krishna consciousness. And in the Vedic literatures also, Krishna himself says, Vedesha Sarvair Ahameva Vedyaha. So this is like the defining factor through which we should approach the Vedic literatures, that although these things are mentioned, there are different statements in the Shrutis, there are different statements in the Smritis regarding different types of worship and different types of goals, but actually everything is meant for pure devotional service unto the Lord himself. And this is one statement, Vedesha Sarvair Ahameva Vedyaha, that Krishna himself says. Then Madhvacharya also calls Vede Ramayane Chaiva Purana Vede Ramayane Chaiva Purane Bharate Tatha Adav Ante Cha Madhye Cha Hari Sarvatra Giyate. So all the different statements might apparently seem that they are not actually speaking about devotional service unto the Lord, but actually speaking, everything is meant for devotional service unto the Lord. So now this idea or this understanding comes only to one who actually takes up pure devotional service in proper parampara. So he can actually reconcile all the statements of the Vedic literatures and how they fall in the entire gamut of the Vedic corpus, so that the living entity can ultimately attain his eternal constitutional position as a servant of the Lord. So this is a defining factor. This Jivera Swarupahoy Krishna Dithiras, Chaitanya Mahaprabhu says this. So the Jiva's constitutional position is to be a pure devotee of the Lord, as a servant of the Lord. So with that perspective, with this understanding, with this philosophical understanding, when we approach the Vedic statements, then everything starts making sense. So then, it is not Vyartha anymore. It is not, these statements are not useless anymore. They actually become a complete cohesive whole in which the entire Vedic literatures can be understood, and one can progress towards devotional service. So that is there. So this is also indicated in the second verse of Srimad Bhagavatam, the first canto, first chapter. Dharma projita kaitavatra paramo nirmat saranam satam vedyam vastavam attra vastu shivadam tapatraya unmulanam Srimad Bhagavate Mahamuni krite kimva pare rishvaraha. Kimva pare rishvara basically means what need is required for any other scripture, and Srimad Bhagavatam is there. So when we study Srimad Bhagavatam, so we get the essence of all the Shruti statements also, and all the Upanishadic statements as well. Srimad Bhagavatam, as we know, is said to be the commentary on Brahma Sutra, which is the Vedanta Sutra, or which is the end of all Vedic scriptures. So Srimad Bhagavatam providing that particular understanding. Now with that understanding, if we approach the other Shruti statements, then everything becomes quite proper. So when it speaks about dharma, artha, kama and moksha, in devotee's life also, these principles can be dovetailed. So when dharma, the concept of dharma, then when the concept of dharma is being spoken, then the devotee, how he understands is dharma is to follow the instructions of the Lord, right? So dharmam tu sakshat bhagavat pranitam. So whatever the Lord says, whatever the Lord's instructions are, that becomes dharma for the living entity. And whatever artha he attains or whatever he has, he dovetails that in Krishna consciousness. He uses that money or that opulence for the Lord's service. And kama for him is basically the satisfaction of the Lord. So again in the 6th chapter, we studied that recently, so that's why I'm quoting from there. So 6th chapter, Srila Prabhupada specifically writes that the living entity, he satisfies himself by the satisfaction of the Lord. So this verse comes in 6th chapter, Yukta hara viharasya, Yukta cheshtasya karmasu, Yukta swapnava bohudasya, Yogi bhavati dukkhaha. So here we see Krishna speaks, Yukta hara viharasya. So it's ahara and vihara. Vihara basically means his recreational activities. Ahara means his eating. Yukta hara viharasya, Yukta cheshtasya karmasu. And whatever endeavors he engages into, whatever activities he performs, that also is Yukta. And Yukta swapnava bodhasya is even his sleeping also is Yukta. So this word Yukta basically means one who is connected with the absolute truth. So in the translation itself, Srila Prabhupada translates Yukta as regulated. But then if we see the meaning of Yukta itself means one who is in Yukta or one who is in conjunction with the absolute truth. So his Yukta ahara, Yukta vihara, Yukta ahara viharasya, Yukta cheshtasya karmasu, his eating habits, his sleeping, his recreational activities, and all the endeavors that he performs within this, through all the endeavors that he performs within this material world or the spiritual world, everything is dovetailed to Krishna consciousness, Yukta. So although apparently it looks like he's performing some mental activities in terms of eating, sleeping, his recreational activities and other endeavors that he's doing, but these are actually dovetailed in Krishna consciousness. So Yukta hara viharas, it's all Yukta. So that way the enjoyment or the satisfaction that the devotee derives is also from the satisfaction of the Lord, from the service of the Lord. So that's how his kama principle is then accommodated. And moksha means moksha Vishnu Angri Labham. Now this is Srila Baldev Vidyabhushan in his Pramay Ratnavali. When he's listing the 9 pramayas, he says this, that moksha is basically devotional service onto Lord Vishnu. Moksha, Vishnu Angri Labham. Vishnu Angri means the lotus feet of the Lord. So moksha, our definition or the devotee's definition of moksha is basically service onto the lotus feet of the Lord. So this is basically how a devotee understands these 4 principles, and all the Shruti statements are reconciled according to these way. This is the proper understanding of dharma, artha, kama, and moksha. And one who independently does that, of course, there is some amount of purification, but then he will never be able to attain the highest destination unless he takes up the process of pure devotional service. Right. So, and Shri Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also spoke about this Pancham Purushartha, Prema Pumartha Mahan. So, this is the final step. So, Moksha Vishnu Angri Labham. So, devotional service onto the Lord leads to, so Moksha basically is defined like this, but the highest realm of attaining the spiritual perfection, the highest position of spiritual perfection is love for Krishna. Correct. So, so similarly, when so these 4 principles, dharma, artha, kama, moksha, they are automatically attained in Krishna consciousness. So one does not have to endeavor separately for them. And as we spoke that by following these principles of dharma, artha, kama and moksha, one becomes purified, and this purification ultimately should result in Krishna consciousness. So all the one may be following the Shruti statements or the Vedic literatures properly, and he may have attained perfection in these 4 things, unless and until he gets the association of a pure devotee of the Lord to attain this particular understanding, or to come to this understanding that Krishna consciousness is the topmost goal. It's very difficult, or we can say almost impossible. So that's why there are several things which can be discussed according to this verse, but we are short on time. So so the conclusion is that association of pure devotee is required, through which one can understand the statements of Srimad Bhagavatam, one can attain the perfection of study of Vedic literatures, and devotees are actually not concerned only about their own perfection. So devotees completely understand that the conception of material bondage, the conception of liberation, is all a manifestation of ignorance. But they are never bothered only about their own liberation. They are actually seeking out for the mercy of the Lord by helping others. Correct. So they want to give association to others also, so that they can also understand that this entire conception of good and bad within this material world is actually illusory. Chaitanya Mahaprabhu also says that in Chaitanya Charitamrita that ye bhanda ye bhala, ye bhala ye bhanda, ye sab mano bhrama. So it's all no, it's all mental speculation that this is good, this is bad, these activities are good, these activities are bad. Because within this material world, one who's influenced within this material world and he wants to enjoy separately from the Lord, everything is bad. It does not matter what is auspicious, what is inauspicious, according to the Shruti statement itself. Now, there are pious activities mentioned in the Vedic literature. There are impious activities, which are activities which are not performed according to Vedic literatures. But these pious activities also, which lead one to elevation to heavenly planets or even to the platform of Brahmaloka, they are also completely illusory only. So they don't have any essence or they don't have any meaning actually in one's life. So these are all manodharma. So there is no good and bad within this material world. Everything is bad unless and until we understand that the entire conclusion of the Vedic scriptures is to render devotional service, pure devotional service unto the Lord. And that is how all the statements of the Vedic literatures are to be reconciled. Right. So these are just some points. Of course, we can elaborate on this with respect to the spirit soul being distinct from matter, how the creation happens, and then how the Mayavadis speak about this in a different way. The devotees have a different understanding. Many things can be spoken, but probably for next time. So I'll stop here. If you have any questions, you can take one. Yes. Okay. So thank you so much. Srimad Bhagavatam ki jai, Srila Prabhupada ki jai.